Hi, this is Siddharth Aluwalia. Welcome to the 100x Entrepreneur Podcast. Today I have a very special guest, Rajan Anandan, ex-VP Google, India and Southeast Asia, and a prolific angel investor. Welcome Rajan to the podcast.
Thank you, Siddhartha, for having me. It's great to be here.
The startup ecosystem which we have in India today, we seem to have entered a new phase of the Indian startup ecosystem. What has really changed?
Yeah, I think we've certainly entered a new phase in the ecosystem. I think there have been several important things that have changed. I mean, it hasn't been a sudden change, but really over the last, I'd say, probably 12, 18 months, right? I think the first is many more Indians are connected to the internet, but more than connected, they're connected with high-speed networks. So today we have, north of 400 million Indians that are active every single day on the internet, and they're spending 4 or 5 hours a day, right? And that's thanks to the very affordable broadband networks that we have in India. So that's pretty important because, when you have 400 million of us connected with high-speed networks and spending enormous amounts of time, that creates the opportunity to scale very, very fast. So you see consumer internet companies that are scaling on the user side very, very quickly. So I think that's a big change. I think second is we're seeing broad basing of startups, right? It used to be for a long time, all the action was in consumer internet companies. But actually, if you look at the data last year, there were more B2B tech companies founded than B2C tech companies in India, right? So you've seen a broad basing within the tech sector, but actually the story goes well beyond tech startups, right? We've seen really now we're beginning to see lots of interesting companies in consumer products, in medical devices, in life sciences, and many other sectors. So I think broad basing of the startup ecosystem is a very, very important dynamic that especially many of us are actually watching very, very closely. I think third, the pace of scale up has changed dramatically, right? I think Udaan brought in a new wave where, $0 to $1 billion valuation in 2 years. I mean, if you had asked me 2 years ago whether India would have a unicorn go from founding to $1 billion valuation in 2 years, I would have said not for a very long time. So I think the fact that, you can scale companies very fast. Last year we had 8 new unicorns, right? And in fact, this year in the first 4 months, we've had 4 new unicorns. So India is now at a clip of about 8 to 10 unicorns being created a year. So that's actually been quite different. And I think the last 2 things are, we're seeing now entrepreneurs come out of existing unicorns, right? So if you look at Udaan, for instance, was ex-Flipkart, the founders from ex-Flipkart. You look at many other companies now. You have second-time entrepreneurs. Bulbul was, Sachin actually is third-time entrepreneur. You look at Kunal with CRED, is again, right? These are sort of seasoned entrepreneurs who are coming out. So you've got this combination of second, third-time entrepreneurs as well as young entrepreneurs who've actually grown up in sort of very, very fast-growing companies. So they've seen the movie before. And then the last thing is, look, the funding environment is very, very positive. I mean, there was a time where it was very difficult to raise 10 million. Then it became very difficult to raise 100 million. And today in India, you could raise $1 billion, right? So I think the funding environment has changed. So all of that put together creates a very interesting cocktail, if you will. And, we are very much on track, I think, to have 100 unicorns in India by 2025. So it's a very, very exciting new phase for the Indian startup ecosystem.
How has monetizing getting better in the last 2-3 years of the startup ecosystem?
Yeah, I think monetization has been very difficult, right? I think for quite some time, India is really about a user growth story. On the B2C side, now we're specifically talking about tech startups and, within tech startups, B2C startups. I think that is changing, right? It's changing because of a couple of reasons. One, if you look at existing markets today, they're not huge, but they're quite sizable. You've got a $30 billion e-commerce market. You've got a ride-hailing market that's quite large, and so on and so forth. But really, one of the reasons it's actually changed is payments. Right? UPI has been the biggest boon that's happened to the Indian startup ecosystem because now you have, over 100 million Indians that actually transact online. And the fact that you can actually pay not just 1,000 or 1,500 rupees, but you can very simply pay, 10 or 20 or 30 or 100 rupees. So I think monetization is improving. It's still very early days, but the fact that, Byju's has 1.5 million paying users, right? And it's really a subscription business if you think about it. There are quite a number of companies that now have, 10, 15, 20, 100,000 subscribing users. So whether it's commerce with transaction-driven activity, whether it's subscriptions, and then lastly, I think advertising is the overall market is getting to be quite sizable. It's a couple of $1 billion, and I think now what we're seeing is e-commerce companies, Flipkart, Amazon, Nykaa, companies like that, beginning to monetize through performance-based advertising. So I would say it's a lot better than what it was 2 years ago, and I'm actually very encouraged by the signs that we're seeing on monetization.
What are your views on SaaS? We have $1 billion startup right now, Freshdesk, and tens of more waiting to be the next unicorn.
Yeah, no. So I've been a big believer in SaaS for a long time. In fact, if you look at my angel portfolio, more than half my investments are actually in SaaS companies, right? I think, look, we're still, I think, a few years away from having sort of hyper value creation or hyper growth in Indian startups. In fact, this year we'll see, I think, our second. Actually, we today have two, right? So Zoho's been a unicorn for a long time. We don't talk about Zoho, but probably will end up being the best ROI anybody could have ever had, because Sridhar's never raised any money externally, right? Freshworks, as you said, was the second. This year we'll certainly see a third. Actually, very soon you'll hear about a third SaaS unicorn. And then I think we're at about one a year now. Last year was Freshworks. We're probably, we'll probably be at one a year for a few years, but then, somewhere around 2022, 2023, we'll start seeing, several SaaS unicorns every year, right? So if I look at my portfolio, companies like Groww, Capillary, Innovace, Unifor, these are all super interesting companies, right? So there's been one model there are two models actually. The India to US model. Freshworks was sort of more of a digital distribution model. Groww was much more sort of enterprise, US India enterprise focused sort of software SaaS play, and then you're seeing companies like Innovace and Unifor again following sort of more the US India enterprise model. But we're also seeing now the emergence with Capillary, for instance, right? The fact that you can actually build a large business without being in the US. Right, so Capillary is got a very large revenue base now, growing quite fast, and they're not in the US. It's really India, Southeast Asia, GCC, and now actually seeing quite a bit of success in China. So I'm very optimistic about SaaS. I think we need to be realistic how quickly these companies scale. I think it still will take 7, 8, 9, 10 years to get to 100 million net revenue, but you can get there, right? And we are now seeing companies actually prove that you can go from 0 to 1 million ARR in less than a year. You can go from 1 million to 10 million in 2 or 3 years, and that's a huge change that we've seen in the ecosystem. Now, going from 10 million to 100 million will still take some time, and that's why I said we're still a little while away from seeing the kind of growth that we'd like to see. But I continue to be very bullish about SaaS startups from India.
Big spaces like e-com and mobility seeing a lot of renewed interest. Recent investment of Facebook in Meesho. What's your thoughts about that? How are the Ecom 2 or Ecom 3.0 going to look like?
Yeah, look, I think it's a great point, because if you had asked everybody 2 years ago, they would have said e-commerce is over, right? We have Amazon and Flipkart, and they've both spent billions of dollars each. How on earth would any other startups really come up? But the reality is, look, in a country where we have 400 million plus, over 400 million daily actives, only about 70 million Indians actually today transact with e-commerce sites, right? So, it's still less than 20% of the active user base is sort of transacting. So there's a huge amount of headroom that's left. If you call it, the first 50 million Indians have now become very comfortable transacting, right? So they're going to buy lots of different things. So the first big opportunity I think we're going to see, we are beginning to see some companies now, is companies that are going to capitalize on the first 50 million and make them buy things that maybe are different, right? So one of my portfolio companies, Fresh to Home, which actually sells fresh seafood, meats, and so on and so forth, is just on fire, right? It's on fire because these first 50 million users, now that they're comfortable buying phones and fashion and accessories, are buying groceries from companies like Big Basket, but also, fresh seafood, right? So those are set of companies that are going to go after the first 50 million users. And then I think you're seeing this new class of companies, what you call sort of e-commerce 2.0, really social commerce companies. Meesho's been one variety, but then you have companies like SimSim, like Bulbul, like Ecommerce that are really going to go after the non-English audience. Several of them will be video-first products and really leverage sort of the ability for influencers to impact commerce, right? So if you look at the ramp of a company like Bulbul, it's been quite staggering, right? So I do think that we're going to see several billion-dollar companies come out of this new wave. of e-commerce, right? And then mobility is very similar. If you had asked 2 years ago, people would have said, look, there's Ola and Uber. We are not going to have any more players because, any new player that comes up will be up against these two very well-funded, very large companies. But the reality is today, we probably have more activity in mobility than we've ever seen. And these companies are scaling very, very fast, right? So one of my companies is Rapido, which is a two-wheeler ride-sharing company. It's just on fire. It's growing at unprecedented rates, right? You look at companies like Bounce or companies like Yulu, right? These are all going after very, very innovative models. And the reality is, look, most of India only can afford to spend a few rupees for transport, right? And we have to invent models that are going to actually hit that price point or hit those set of price points with viable long-term unit economics, right? And you can't get there with four-wheelers. So my view is the four-wheeler game is pretty much played out, and that's why we're seeing sort of slowing growth on the four-wheeler side. So it's really going to be three-wheelers, two-wheelers, new kind of forms of vehicles, and so on and so forth. And over time, a lot of that will migrate to electric. So I think, again, we are in a whole new era of mobility, and I really do think we're going to see many more new large companies get built in mobility in India.
As you rightly said, India today has a 2 million e-rickshaw unorganized market. So a lot of mobility focus areas completely ignored, and a lot of room for entrepreneurs to innovate and enter it.
Yeah, if you think about it, right, massive number of Indians take buses, right? Massive number of Indians are on trains. You mentioned a segment that's very, very interesting. India has 100 million people that have two-wheelers, right? So if you think about sort of a two-wheeler ride-sharing model, it can be super, super interesting. And it's not surprising that Rapido is scaling so fast. So yeah, I think there's just enormous opportunity in sort of the mobility space broadly defined. And we haven't talked about, electric, or we haven't talked about ancillaries and so on and so forth, where there'll be a lot of opportunity.
What are three of your recent investments which you are very excited about, and why?
So I think it's important to keep in mind that I am excited about every company that I invest in, right? That I've invested in. I invest in them because I'm very excited about them. That being said, I think, look, I'm maybe less about most excited about, but maybe I'll tell you about some companies that are very different, that are doing very interesting things, right? I invested last year actually in a company called Gen Robotics. This is a startup from Kerala. They're actually building robots that clean manholes, right? So India has about 4 million scavengers, and they have to actually go into these manholes and clean them. And because of that, most of them really, unfortunately, don't live beyond the age of 32, 33. So what these sort of very young founders from Kerala have done is they've built a robot that they call Bandicoot, which is an assisted robot where they can train now the person who used to be the scavenger to be a robot operator, and these robot then, it basically kind of goes into the manhole and starts cleaning all the switch, right? So you can imagine they've already sold a large number of robots in the state of Kerala. Now they're in Chennai, they're in Hyderabad. They're actually now in discussions with a couple of states in the north, right? So this is really applying AI and robotics. And by the way, the robot, the way it can actually clean the manhole inside is using computer vision, right? So that's a really great example of a solve for India type problem, right? And there's no question this company is going to become very, very large. Another one that's very interesting again is using computer vision is a company called Nayan, N-A-Y-A-N. Jayant, who's the founder, has a PhD in AI and robotics, went to Georgia Tech. He's come back with a mission to make the world's roads safer, right? So what they're doing is basically using really UGC, right? So you should actually, if you haven't, you should download this app called Nayan and try it out. So what Nayan does is you can just download this app, you open it up, you put your smartphone on your dash, and it starts recording real time all the traffic violations that are going on in front of you. And you'd be shocked how many traffic violations there are, right? If you have this thing open for 30 minutes, you'll catch like 45 traffic violations. So what they want to do is essentially partner with police departments, partner with states, and so on and so forth. So today, there's limited data points, right? So you have these radars, you have police cars that actually have some equipment, but really you can't have thousands of them, right? So theoretically, this can become an approach to get, let's say 10 million, 15 million, 20 million users around the world who become real-time capturers of data. And then that data is processed using computer vision to actually identify traffic violations. So that's really, really interesting. They're actually, interestingly, their first big client, it's a B2B business, right? B2B2C business really, is actually is in Dubai. So in fact, that whole team is now in Dubai. working with the Dubai police. So that's actually, I think, a super interesting company. And a third one I would say is a company called Clinic. Clinic is a Bangalore-based startup that is focused on healthcare. If you look at India, there are about 125 million Indians that are under private healthcare insurance. Ayushman Bharat has, let's say, the 500 million who are sort of the 700 million to 1.3 billion range. So essentially, we have about 500 to 600 million Indians that have no health insurance, right? And as we know, health insurance is actually the single biggest driver that can take you from not being in poverty to being in poverty. So what they've done is they've created a very interesting offering where they create a monthly pay-as-you-go, very, very affordable health insurance plan, combined with call a doctor anytime you want, as well as give you, massive discounts with diagnostics, pharmaceuticals, etc., to actually have a subscription-based program. And you'd be surprised, they actually have 30,000 paying subscribers today, and it's growing like crazy. So these would be three examples. They're from three different industries. But what's interesting about all three of these companies is they are truly unique, right? They're unique in terms of how they're applying technology. They're unique in terms of their business model. And most importantly, they're addressing a very peculiar pain point in India. And the second one with Nayan, the reality is nobody follows the traffic laws here.
You, the angel investor, come very early in spaces. For example, when Rapido was raising the angel round, nobody believed in the concept of shared two-wheelers. And similarly, I think the earliest angel investor in SaaS. What are the segments you are now focused on as an angel investor?
Yeah, so look, I've been investing in SaaS for a very long time, right? So, I moved to India in 2000 from the US. In 2005, 2006, I joined the Indian Angel Network. I did one investment that year. That was actually a consumer internet company at that point, which actually eventually became a SaaS company. So about half my portfolio is SaaS. And I would say that is a constant theme, right? Because my view is India is going to create thousands of SaaS companies. Obviously, quite a number of them will become very, very large, but we can build, hundreds of companies that are worth $100 million each in the SaaS space. So that has been a constant theme, but I'm always, the themes that I look for within SaaS change. Vertical SaaS I've been investing in for a very long time, whether it's capillary, Innovator, companies like that. So that's been a big theme. And then on the consumer side, I would say, my themes have changed, right? I try to get into a space very early. I make a whole bunch of bets and then I move on. So for instance, I was investing in digital content about 4 or 5 years ago, right? So PopX or Miss Malini, Little Black Book, a whole bunch of other companies. But then I stopped, right? I invested in Mamaearth, which is probably one of the most interesting healthcare content startups in India about maybe 2 or 3 years ago, but I haven't really invested in that. So I tend to get into a space early because I have a set of hypotheses, and then I'll make a bunch of investments. I was very early investor in fintech, did quite a number of investments in fintech, and then I just basically moved on to. So it tends to be very, 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 very thematic. And then outside of tech, I've made very selective investments, more as a learning investments, right? So I've made a few investments in life sciences and healthcare as a way to kind of learn a new space. So I would say there's sort of the main meal, if you will, which is SaaS, and then there are consumer internet themes that sort of change over a period of time. But all that being said, look, at the end of the day, the bet that I'm making is less about the space. Obviously, space is important. Is really about the founding team. I'm at the end of the day, the reason I invested in Rapido was, the thesis around two-wheelers was very, very interesting. And if it worked, it would be a large business. But it was the fact that Arvind and his team, these ex-Flipkart founders, just seem like super ambitious, very, very focused leaders who are going to go out and build a big business. And that's been the case with every single company that I'm in. I'm making a bet on a founding team.
So what are the two theses or two focus areas you have for 2019-20?
No, I would say, look, I think, SaaS is a space that will continue to see lots of action, right? You look at companies today, they're able to go from, $0 to $1 million in revenue from India in less than 12 months. If you had asked me 10 years ago when Groww started, we don't have a single penny of revenue from India, right? So I think lots of things are changing in SaaS, and I think that's, I'll continue to be quite bullish about that. It's interesting, this year all of Tiger's investments have been, almost all of Tiger's investments have been in the SaaS space, which is quite interesting. But on the consumer side, look, I think there's a lot of white space in as I said, mobility. I think there's a lot of, look, every space actually has a lot of opportunity, right? Because the reality is we have 1 billion Indians who haven't come online yet, right? Only, 1 billion Indians almost who are not on the internet yet. and each of them, and we have massive unmet needs, right? So you look at a space like education. I think India could have 10 unicorns in the education space. Today we have one called Byju's. I think we're going to see many more companies in the education space simply because there's a massive need. I think fintech, payments has been played out, but just as we thought, payments has been played out with UPI, Bharat Pay comes along and then boom, right? I mean, they created this extraordinary success by focusing on merchants, right? So in all these spaces where we seem to think that, they're getting crowded, all of a sudden you see a player, but India has a $300 billion SME credit cap, right? So I think we're going to see lots of action with SME credit on the consumer lending side. Healthcare, I think, has massive amounts of white space. I think we've had one or two waves of it, companies like Practo and then companies like the e-pharmacies like HealthCart and so on. But I think it's still very, very early and we're going to see lots of very interesting companies come up in healthcare. And then you look at spaces like agri, right? I think there's now a bit of discussion on agri. I've got a company called Groww Farm that I invested in, which actually does farm to retailer, scaling very, very nicely, right? And these are like, businesses that have very clear pain points. You're not trying to figure out what problem are you solving. The problem is super, super clear. So now the question is, can you develop a solution and then execute it superbly, right? So I think agri is going to be very interesting. So as I look around, I think every industry has a lot of white space. The question is, can you put the right team together? Does the founding team have very deep insight about what they're really trying to solve? Can they start going at it and then, pivot, iterate, morph, and then execute like crazy?
You have been investing for the last 13 years and in hundreds of founders. What has been different about the companies which have been mega hit?
Yeah, so I think, firstly, I've been investing for a lot longer than that. Since the early 90s, I'm actually much older than you are. So, in the US anyway. But yes, in India, I have been investing since I moved, since 2006 or so. Look, I think it's difficult to pinpoint. There is no one model for success, right? But I think a lot of it really boils down to the founding team, the founder or the founding team, right? I think the teams that have been very successful, they have incredibly deep insight about the problem that they're trying to solve, like uncanny, insight about the problem that they're trying to solve. They tend to be very, very resilient because, before you get to a unicorn, you're going to have 4 or 5 near-death moments. So you cannot give up in those times. They tend to be very agile. So they'll pivot the business. Sometimes they'll radically change the business that they have now. You can't even recognize the business that I funded when I was an angel, and I'm totally okay with that. For instance, Dunzo, where I was the first investor, when I funded them, they were basically a WhatsApp. They were using WhatsApp to help people in Bangalore kind of get things around them, right? And now today, when you look at it, it's become a whole different kind of platform, still in the hyper-local space, but a very, very different kind of. So I think the ability for the team to really morph based on learnings, be agile, live through very, very difficult periods. I think that is probably those are the set of things that have been very important. I think there are a few other things about the founding team that are quite important for those that have been very successful. Their ability to raise money, right? There are founders who are good at raising funding and there are founders that are not. I think the ones that have been successful, even in a SaaS company to become a unicorn, you need to raise $50, $100, $150 million at a minimum, right? It's very difficult to get there with $20 million, even in a SaaS company. So, and if you're a consumer internet company, you have to raise hundreds of millions of dollars. So your ability to raise money becomes pretty important. Who's on your cap table matters a lot, right? If you have tier 1 investors on your cap table, it gets easier. If you don't, it gets harder. And if you're a consumer internet company that needs to raise billions of dollars, there's only one investor who can afford billions of dollars. So getting them on your cap table kind of becomes important. That's a sort of a more recent phenomenon. And then the space matters, right? I think, timing is pretty important, right? So, if you had asked me, 10 years ago, it was not the time for education. So in fact, my first investment in India was a edu-tech startup, right? We were probably 7-8 years too early, right? So timing matters a lot. The space matters a lot, right? I think going after a problem that's large enough, I still see too many Indian founders going after small problems, right? Don't build a feature. Don't go after a small problem. Go after a very large problem set. Now, obviously, start with a very focused solution, but be open to very quickly changing it. And because of the cost structure in India, right, and also because of the need, a lot of our companies end up being full stack companies, right? So be open to that. Be open to doing things that maybe otherwise, you don't read about in TechCrunch, right? You don't read about full stack businesses as much in TechCrunch, whereas in China, you see a lot of tech. So these are the kinds of things that have been. So it's not one particular formula, but I would say a large part of it really is the founding team, and were they able to kind of, change as they go, be very, very quick, and be incredibly resilient. I think if there's one word about founding teams that become these 100x teams, because it's not really an entrepreneur, right? It's a team. They are really this ability to be resilience and grit are super, super important.
Thank you so much, Rajan. It was wonderful to have you on the podcast, and thank you so much for sharing your views, your thoughts, and your mindset with the listeners.
Absolutely. Thanks for having me, Siddhartha.